Thank you very much for having me. Thank you especially to Senator Brandis, whom I'm going to talk about a little bit more. I'm really honored to be here. It is hard to understand why I'm here because I'm from New York. But actually it makes a lot of sense because as a New Yorker, I spend a lot of time in Florida. And of course, this week it's terrible in New York. The traffic is terrible, the temperature is terrible. And also, it's strange that I'm here because I really like driving. In fact, there's nothing I hate more than the idea of self-driving cars. Or so I thought. 10 years ago, I was part of a crew of people who, in the words of another friend who's here, who used to work in law enforcement, we drove cross-country and set the cannonball run record. And in his words, when he presented me to an audience of law enforcement officials, he said, "Never had so few accomplish so much on behalf of so few." And that's still true today, but luckily, I'm here talking to you and going to be introducing several very interesting people who are trying to do the opposite of what I did, which is to accomplish a lot on behalf of more people than have ever been helped in the history of transportation, which has generally been a history of great selfishness and kind of a Machiavellian war to get from A to B as quickly as possible at the expense of everyone else on the road. And I should know, because I devoted my entire life to getting cross-country as quickly as possible, and every year I go out again and again and risk my life for nothing. So in light of that, I actually think that self-driving cars and automation and autonomy are the most important thing, the most ethical and moral possible thing that technology can deliver to us in my lifetime. I am not absolutely convinced that we will reach 100% ubiquity in my lifetime or ever. But I do believe that in a world where most of the demonstrations we see are in fact self-driving theater, no better than the security theater which we've seen, that there are people doing real work. And those people are on stage here with us today. And most importantly, there are very few politicians, but there are some, like Senator Brandis, who are light years ahead of almost everyone else in elected office, trying to make a better world a reality. And this particular conference is a really revelation to me because I've been to a lot of conferences and most of them are filled with people who literally have no idea what they're talking about. And this event is one of those exceptions. We are now going to hear from Alden Woodrow from Uber, after which I will very cynically pick apart everything that each of them has said to determine how much of it was self-driving theater. Alden I don't know as well as I know Riley, so I'm going to have to go to the notes. Alden leads the product development at Uber for self-driving trucks. Previously was with Otto, and who completed the famous Budweiser beer haul. I'm not sure you should be bragging about that. And previously you were at Google X and spent a decade as an economic and environmental consultant. That all sounds very impressive, but now you're going to have to live up to this resume. Alden, please talk to us.
Thanks very much. Good morning. I'm very happy to be here. Alden Woodrow. I work on self-driving trucks at Uber, and I'm the product lead there, which means I'm responsible for helping turn our very promising technology into a real and reliable and safe commercial product. Since we're talking about transportation, I just wanted to share something I learned, today, which is that it is possible to be in San Francisco at 7 p.m. and be here at 9 a.m. the next morning. It does not involve a lot of sleep, and so if I fall asleep during this presentation, I apologize, and I will also forgive you if you nod off as well. So we've had our heads down for quite some time since the beer run that Alex mentioned, working on our technology, working on our product. But I want to talk today a little bit about our vision for the future, and this is sort of the first time we're planning to talk about this pretty explicitly. Also just want to mention that we're very proud to be sponsors of this event and excited to be here. I have some other colleagues who are here today who are going to be talking about the car side of things. I'll be focusing on trucks. So just to kind of start off, by a show of hands, how many of you have ever ridden in an Uber? Okay, so we probably don't need to spend too much time covering Uber as a company, but some of the things you may or may not know, Uber is actively providing ride-sharing services in over 600 cities around the world with millions of driver partners every day. A lot of this has happened in the last couple of years. And I think the most kind of interesting statistic about this that I learned after joining the company was that something like only about 15% of the population of the United States has actually ridden in an Uber before. So there's a tremendous amount of opportunity for growth and future work in ride sharing, specifically even in the United States. So I want to talk about self-driving, obviously, today, and Uber's mission as a whole is to help make transportation better for everyone. That's something the company's been working on for several years now and has recently begun investing in self-driving technology. So that began with the founding of Uber's Advanced Technologies Group in 2015, and that was a focus on cars. The team has had great progress in the last couple of years, building a world-class team with many, many talented engineers, and actually launching self-driving Uber products in 2 cities, in Pittsburgh, which is the home of ATG, and in Phoenix. In both of those places, today it's possible to hail a self-driving Uber from the Uber app. So if you happen to be in Pittsburgh or Phoenix in the near future, I recommend giving it a try. They do have drivers in the seat, but it's a fun experience, and you get a nice visualization in the back of what the vehicle is seeing as it's driving around. We also have facilities in Toronto, which is an emerging center for artificial intelligence, and then obviously in San Francisco, where our truck team is based. We're making good progress on the car front. I'm obviously here to talk about moving things and not moving people, so we'll focus on that a little bit. Today, Alex mentioned the Budweiser beer run that the auto team did about a year ago, which got a lot of great attention and was sort of a preview of some of the things we see coming in the future. The auto team, which was a small startup at the time, has joined Uber, and now we're all part of the same team working on these 2 products, self-driving cars and self-driving trucks, using a lot of the same underlying technology. Now, there are obviously differences because of the vehicle platform and the applications that we have for the technology. Cars are intended to move people around, trucks are intended to move things, but we're excited about the opportunity to make use of the underlying technology for both of these products. We're also investing in a product called Uber Freight, which takes a slightly different view and different approach to solving problems in the industry, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. That's a separate team, but Uber Freight is a free app that connects carriers and shippers and allows them to book loads at the touch of a button with the kind of magic that we've all come to experience with the Uber app. So that's an exciting opportunity, and it sort of merges in with some of the things we're doing on self-driving trucks, and I'll touch on that in a moment. So we're investing in trucking because as a company, we feel really optimistic about what the future holds for the industry. I think many of you in this room know about and understand the significance of trucking to the United States. It's obviously a very large industry, $700 billion annually, but actually 70%, nearly 70% of the freight that moves around the country moves on a truck. So nearly everything we see and touch, from our clothing to our coffee to our smartphones, has spent time on a truck. And trucks are responsible for a disproportionate number of miles relative to the number of vehicles that exist. So trucks are moving a lot and moving a lot of things. So at the heart of that industry are over 3 million truck drivers who keep these trucks moving and keep the economy moving. And this all adds up to something like 250 pounds of stuff per person per day moving on a truck. So very, very important to all of our lives in ways that we don't always appreciate, and obviously a lot of people behind that importance and making things continue to move. In addition to the importance of the industry, there are also a fair number of significant challenges that the industry faces. I'm going to talk about some of those today. Some of them are more present and some of them are more in the future, but we're investing because of our optimism about the future and hoping that we can find ways to help solve some of those problems. And so I'm going to talk through some of those before I get to talking about kind of our concrete vision for the future. So the first thing we're trying to do, something that many of you are already very familiar with, is address this problem of fatalities on the road. So you all know the statistics, the many tens of thousands of deaths that happen on roads with cars and trucks every year. And as I mentioned, trucks are a disproportionate participant in this unfortunate statistic. The statistic we talk about frequently is that trucks are about 1% of the total number of vehicles on the road, about 6% of the miles driven, and about 10% of fatalities. Now, it's worth noting that given the number of miles that trucks drive every year, it's about 170 billion miles a year, it's actually very impressive that there are so few fatalities on a relative basis, numbering in around the thousands. And it's actually a credit to the very high quality products that truck manufacturers make today that have a tremendous number of safety features. And it's also a credit to the skills and professionalism of truck drivers who are very careful on the roads and take their jobs very seriously. So it's, in a relative sense, it's actually quite an impressive accomplishment. There are so few, but we still think it's far too many, and we think that self-driving trucks and self-driving cars along the way will have an opportunity to help solve this problem. Another thing we're trying to do is improve the efficiency of the industry on the truck front. So some of the challenges the industry faces here are that shipments take far longer than would probably be necessary due to things like congestion on the roads, long load times at facilities, loading and unloading times where drivers are sitting around waiting, as well as the very manual process of booking and coordinating loads between carriers and shippers and brokers, something that's actually a very surprisingly manual process involving a lot of phone calls and faxes and a lot of that kind of coordination in today's world where emerging technologies can help solve some of those problems. That's sort of the challenge that Uber Freight is trying to get at, but we think that self-driving trucks can help address that problem as well and overall save time and money and improve the efficiency of the system overall. The last thing which I'm going to talk more about today is about improving livelihoods for people. So I mentioned before how important drivers are to the trucking industry. And it's worth noting that a lot of drivers spend something like 200 days a year on the road, sitting in their vehicles, sleeping in their vehicles, away from home, missing birthdays and other important family events. This is a really difficult job and a really difficult life, and there's been a lot of really good coverage over the last year or so as self-driving trucks have kind of emerged as an opportunity, discussing how truck drivers can often be kind of left behind or forgotten as part of this important industry. So we see it as quite important for the product that we're building to make sure that we think about truck drivers and that we find ways to help improve their livelihoods rather than marginalize them. So working on that, and we think the model that we're considering, which I'll talk about in a little bit, can help do that. So before I get to talking about that vision, and I want to talk a little bit about some history that informs how we think about this, I want to show you something that relates directly to this idea of improving livelihoods, and that's to step away from the product that I work on and talk about Uber Freight again. So Uber Freight, obviously, not something that we're all using every day because it's very focused on moving goods around the country, and truck drivers can use it to book loads at the touch of a button. I want to show you a quick video of a new feature that Uber Freight released relatively recently that's very focused on trying to solve a very specific problem that truck drivers face in the world today. So it's a video that I hope will work here, and we'll see what happens.
Since 1989, I think I've driven over 3 million miles. The hardest part of the job is being away from the family. I constantly miss things because I'm out on the road. Last year, for the holidays, I couldn't get back to see my son before he left to go back to college.
It's things like that that he misses, that he shouldn't have to. I would love it if Frank could be home more.
That's one of the biggest things I regret in life, not being there for all those moments. Uber Freight said, well, what's one thing we could do for you? And I said, get me home. And they went and created a feature called Take Me Home. They'll get me a load out, and they'll find me a load that brings me home. It's all about family. That's the sole reason I do what I do. I'm Frank Lovell. I know that Uber Freight will take me home.
So obviously a different product than the one that I work on, but it really helps inform the way we try to think about solving problems for people, and informs how we think about what the future might hold for people like Frank, and what the future might hold for the trucking industry as a whole. So one last thing I want to spend a little bit of time on before I get to talking more about what this vision looks like for us is to talk about a couple of historical antecedents that we talk about a lot internally and that we think kind of preview and inform what's coming in the future. Some things that many of you are already quite familiar with, but I think are pretty interesting. So we're going to nerd out on history here for a second. So the first historical moment, I will take you back to 1869, where in the middle of Utah, two teams were meeting up for the first time and laying the final section of track in the Transcontinental Railroad. The teams hammered a golden spike into that final track to signify the connection of now an intercontinental system to move things across the country, across North America. It turns out actually not entirely across. The first segment of the Intercontinental Railroad went from Omaha to San Francisco, where our truck team is based. This is what in Silicon Valley we would call a minimum viable product. So not exactly the East Coast, but pretty close. And you know what's I think significant about this is that it really significantly changed the way people and things could move across the country. A journey that previously would have taken months and could be quite dangerous. Now could be done in a matter of weeks, if not less, in much greater comfort. And this was a real step change in transportation in the United States, and an incredibly ambitious effort involving many, many people to get that working properly, and obviously an incredible engineering feat. So there's a lot about this experience that we take inspiration from. The next historical reference I want to touch on is one that's already been mentioned here today, which is about 100 years later in the 1950s and the creation of the Eisenhower Interstate Highway System. So rail worked pretty well at this point and was a nice wide network across the United States and a pretty efficient way to move. But for shorter distances, there was actually a much better system, and that was the automobile. So for driving around in the 1950s, it was pretty easy to get around cities and towns, but still pretty difficult to get across the United States. I almost put some pictures of ruddy, mudded roads with 1950s era vehicles stuck in the mud. But I like this one of Eisenhower, I guess, drawing what the intercontinentals, the interstate system would look like. I'm pretty sure they put more thought into it than that. But so getting across the country in a car was still pretty inefficient, but there was this very ambitious effort, in part also driven by growing tensions with the Soviet Union and our need to move military assets around the country, to invest in a continental scale road network that would allow us to move around more efficiently. And so as a country, we decided to invest in this, and it took a number of decades, actually. And in 1986, there was another event in Utah, amazingly, to connect I-80, which was ultimately the first fully transcontinental network of roads that you could drive continuously from the East Coast to the West Coast, also, by the way, ending in San Francisco. So that was similarly ambitious and really impressive engineering accomplishment. And I was looking this up a little bit just to sort of inform myself better recently, and found there's actually a 1994 study that concludes that manufacturing industries in the United States were able to lower their costs by 24% because of the opportunities and the efficiency created by the highway system. That's just like an astounding statistic of what kind of efficiencies it created for the economy overall. So a massive accomplishment. And for people, this new highway system meant a new way to move around the country and the kind of creation of the famous road trip that we all know about today. And obviously for trucks, it changed the way they could move around America and built the foundation for the way today's freight system works. So we take inspiration from both of these very impressive feats of engineering and these ambitious efforts to try to make these step changes. And this one in particular, changed moving from across the country in a matter of weeks to moving in a matter of hours or days. I guess if you're Alex, quite a bit faster than most of us probably, but very, very impressive accomplishment. So we're now working towards trying to create another big step change in how we move people and things within and around the country. And the focus for us, as I've touched on already, is about how do we do that in a way that works for everybody, including truck drivers, when we talk about our specific product. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we envision that. So many of you in the room, I'm sure, are close followers of this emerging technology, and it's hard not to miss headlines like these. I could have included probably another 100 of them or so if I made the font small enough. And the suggestion that self-driving trucks are going to spell the end of the American truck driver, they're going to decimate the industry. Now, these are very understandable concerns and understandable questions, actually, and I think as a leader in this space, we have not done an adequate job of talking about how we envision the future, and that's part of what we want to try to start doing today in a small way. But I think suffice to say, this is not how we envision the future. In fact, we have a much more optimistic view on what self-driving trucks will mean for people, and we're specifically building our product to try to focus on those opportunities. So when we look towards the future, we envision a future that creates more opportunities for truck drivers, not less. Self-driving trucks and truck drivers will work together to move America's freight, and I'm going to talk specifically about how we envision that. And also, as I touched on before, hope to solve problems like fatalities and the efficiency of the overall system. Okay, so this graphic's a little bit zoomed in, but I'm going to talk a little bit about this model that we envision. This is, I don't think exactly a new concept, but we're now starting to talk more openly about how we envision this working and why it makes sense for self-driving trucks for us and for Uber Freight as a network. So, the vision we have for the future is that self-driving trucks will manage long-haul driving on interstate highways without drivers. But of course, having two hands on the wheel will still be the best way to get a load from the interstate to its final destination. Truck drivers possess the critical skills that self-driving trucks may never match, like backing into a tight dock, navigating a busy industrial yard, or moving axles on a trailer. So we envision self-driving trucks beginning to handle some long-haul routes on highways and transfer hubs springing up near cities and towns, and those can be the central exchanges where self-driving trucks and truck drivers meet up to switch loads. So just to give you an example, a driver might go into a transfer hub to drop off a load of Florida oranges and leave the transfer hub with a load of California avocados that just came off of a self-driving truck. We envision Uber Freight helping coordinate those transfers and allowing them to take only minutes instead of the hours that it can take today. And we think this kind of efficiency will allow drivers to keep moving, to continue earning, and also stay closer to home. For drivers who prefer the open road, of course, there will be plenty of opportunities to continue driving long-haul routes in the years to come. We envision self-driving trucks taking up, over time, only a small portion of the routes that currently dot the entire landscape. So, this is a specific model. We've thought about a lot of different approaches that we might take here, and we think because of the pain points that Uber Freight solves for drivers, and because of the capabilities that we expect the self-driving truck to have, this model of highway operation with transfer hubs and working in complement to truck drivers doing local hauls can unlock a lot of that efficiency, solve a lot of these challenges, and still create a lot of opportunities and a lot of choice for truck drivers. So here's what this would look like at continental scale. It's probably a little bit hard to tell from the colors, but this is from Department of Transportation Freight Analysis Framework data, and it's effectively a map of where trucks drive today. And you can see the interstate highway system in sort of the lighter blue and those local routes in green. And as we look at this, we see just a tremendous opportunity for both truck drivers and for self-driving trucks to haul loads and find ways to coordinate those activities and make sure that things continue moving around the country. And what's so powerful about this is this approach makes a lot of business sense and a lot of product sense. It's really a way of unlocking a lot of this efficiency, and it also ensures that it's complementary to truck drivers, making most use of their skills, where self-driving trucks will have a difficult, if not impossible time. So there's a lot to this vision. We think there's a lot of incredibly positive implications about this model for our economy, for truck driver jobs and truck driver livelihoods, for safety. There's a lot more to talk about this model, more than we can talk about today, but we're planning to share more about this vision in the near future and in the coming months and talk specifically about those implications. I'm sure Alex will have some questions about it. And we see this as kind of the start of a conversation about the future of trucking and about this technology and the role we can play to make a brighter future for everybody. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Alden. Lock the doors, because I've got some questions, and someone's going to run from the room. There'll be an opportunity to do a Q&A. We are a little ahead of schedule because of the unfortunate events that the mayor could not be here. So we'll use that time to the extent that people would like to plaster our guests with questions. I have an opening question, which is that you, Riley, are an investor in Starsky Robotics, which is also a trucking company. And I know that you've both gotten the question about how are you going to address the issue of jobs, because on a conceptual level, it's almost impossible to understand how every single self-driving truck on the road doesn't remove a job. I would like to hear each of you answer that, because I'm not going to answer it for you. Riley, would you like to go first in the context of Starsky's approach?
Sure. I should add that the Starsky founder, Stefan, is here, so he'd probably give a little bit more clarity on this. But I'll answer from our perspective, which is that for the parts of driving, like Alden mentioned, that could be described as simpler than the high-density, low-speed stuff, actually lends pretty well to automated driving. But there's this sort of final, mile, first and last mile, where the human is really the best operator for that today. And so I think the thing I always think about is the timeline. People always ask me, when are we going to have automated vehicles? And I think the key thing is if you blend the best of humans and the best of machines, you can move that timeline forward. If you just absolutely say, when are we going to have full automation, that moment's probably pretty far out in all conditions. But if you break up the task into different segments, then you can actually bring the line forward. He didn't mention it in his presentation, but there's an incredible shortage of drivers in certain segments of commercial truck driving, depending on how you measure it, as maybe 50,000 to 100,000 in the U.S. alone. And it's actually one of the core components of why, if you look at a freight carrier business, they're actually pretty hard to scale based on labor at the moment. And it's pretty easy to buy trucks, it's pretty easy to buy tires by the mile, things like that. But in certain segments, there's a shortage of labor. So could you use parts of technology to, for example, automate the long haul routes? That's certainly one approach. And I think to some extent, it's a great compliment to Starsky, who's been doing this model that Alden described for the better part of a year and a half. And this is what I think many in the automated trucking world have pointed to for a while, which is they don't actually want to automate the full experience. They want to automate segments of it.
Alden, I'd like you to answer the same question, but an additional question for you. Your video showed Uber Freight, and whereby a driver is still driving long haul, but when he chooses to go home, your platform optimizes a run that gets him back home. Makes perfect sense to me. So you foresee actually a future where there are level 5 trucks with drivers local to their homes who just do that type of driving, and then there are still drivers doing long haul during some transition period. Am I correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think over time we expect to see a significant transition to this new approach. Just to be clear, the vision that I was describing before involves level 4 or 5, so self-driving trucks without a driver in the vehicle, handling those interstate hauls, and then local hauls driven by drivers like Frank, if they choose to do so, that allow them to stay closer than home rather than having to drive the thousands of miles away from home in a way that can be pretty monotonous and often quite dangerous. So to the question about jobs, I think the way we envision this, and obviously we don't have a crystal ball, and we only control a very, very small part of how this industry works. So it's not for us to say that this is how things will go, but how we're working and what we're trying to build would enable, we see, a shift, not a loss of jobs or a replacement necessarily of drivers, but a shift to from long haul operations to local operations. For drivers themselves. And just a couple things to note about that without getting too much into the economics, but we've actually spent a lot of time analyzing this model and asked some external third parties to give us their assessment of what the projected impacts of the model I've just described would be. We're going to be talking more about that in the months to come, but just a couple of sort of statistics that are already pretty publicly available. There's already a pretty significant truck driver shortage in the United States, and depending on who you ask, it runs in something like the tens of thousands. In other words, you ask a large carrier like U.S. Express, Max King, who's at a lot of these events, will say if he could seat another 1,000 drivers, he would do it tomorrow, but he has trouble finding enough people to do the job for some of the reasons I described. And the industry, the truck driver workforce in particular, is aging quite rapidly over time, and there's a lot of retirements expected in the years to come from people who are just getting old enough to retire. So there's actually a pretty huge labor shortage, and we see an opportunity to try to address that in addition to shifting some of those jobs from long haul to more local operations.
Before we get to Q&A, we all have observed that there have been some very entertaining incidents with self-driving companies deploying vehicles for testing in certain states and not in others, because opportunity, like investment dollars, flows to where it's easiest to operate. We know that Uber and many other companies in the sector have very aggressive lobbying strategies in order to get policies passed that are more favorable towards testing and deployment. Some states have been smarter than others about this, and Florida is probably at the forefront of very successful efforts to get companies to come operate here. What is the happy meal policy for a company like Uber to get to a place like Florida? Because Nevada, Florida, California, each have slightly different policies, and some states are nowhere on this at all. So could you each, starting with Alden, explain a little bit about your efforts in this direction, both successful and less successful, to get a policy in place that will get this technology deployed?
Yeah, sure. I can speak from my perspective. I mean, I think our policy team is probably best suited to answer the question about what we specifically look for. There's no question that Florida is right at the top of the list in terms of states that have been very forward-looking and thinking about how to set up the appropriate regulatory framework to allow for testing and deployment. So I'll say from a product perspective, when we look at this, regulatory matters are also at the very top of the list when we think about what the geography will look like for initial deployment, up there with the technical circumstances and weather and road complexity and the many, many things that we factor into thinking about where we want to go first and where we want to go next. And so, we work really closely with our policy team and with other experts to understand both what the circumstances are today and where they're headed, because we want to make sure that everything we do, in addition to being safe, is also totally consistent with, local rules and laws. So I think we have obviously a very large policy team, and part of the advantage from our perspective of being part of Uber is because of this nationwide ride-sharing network, we have very close connections to even local policymakers, state policymakers, federal policymakers, to just help inform and educate them about these issues, provide our perspective on kind of how we might move forward. So I may sort of punt the question to Justin Ehrlich, who's one of our members of the policy team.
We'll get to Justin
today. Okay, great. But I think from our perspective, this is a very, very important factor, and it's something we spend a lot of time on and think about very carefully.
I would say, to start with, Florida is one of the top 5 states in terms of AV policy, where I would probably consider Florida, Arizona, California, Nevada, and Michigan at a state level that are really thinking quite, in quite a new way about AVs. I think, however, the thing to keep in mind is cities and counties have so much power, particularly when you get to like, the ride-hailing companies, which ultimately become robo-taxi companies. One example of this could be, cities operating more like an airport, and that there are specific pickup and drop-off points even on a city block, and then doing so warrants some sort of tax that maybe the user pays for, maybe the service pays for. And I actually think that this is the point where cities realize that they have much more power than previously thought. That each one of these rides, whether you're talking about a commercial truck or a robo-taxi autonomous vehicle, is a pickup and drop-off within your city that you should be benefiting from. And I think that cities in general, some of the, I think the sharper knives have realized that this is a tremendous revenue opportunity for them, and that they have the power. And so from my perspective, if you were to kind of think about the best policy, you'd probably want to take a composite of all 5 of those states at a state level, and then you'd want to think about cities or counties that were quite aggressively looking at pickup and drop-off points, not only for revenue but for safety. Right now we kind of just assume you can drop passengers off at any point on a city block. It's actually not a good idea for congestion and for ingress and egress. So something like that. No one has it perfect quite yet.
Well, I know that Alden doesn't actually, well, you are on the trucking side, so maybe you don't care so much about what Riley's referring to, but on a broader level, and this pertains to both taxis and trucks, you both believe that the net outcome of the successful evolution of these platforms is going to be a positive regarding jobs? I mean, it doesn't really seem possible, does it?
Regarding trucking jobs, I think there's a great opportunity for technology to fill the gaps where labor shortages make either trucking impossible or more expensive, so yes. And then for the long-haul routes that he described, it is true that most of the long-haul drivers would prefer to sleep in their own bed at night. And if you could give them the opportunity to do so, whether they're running local routes or they're doing things like teleoperation, then I think that's great. When it comes to robo-taxis in cities, I don't see that being a net positive for job creation. I think taxi drivers and TNC drivers right now in cities, if you move forward to automated vehicles, you're kidding yourself if you think that there's somehow, it doesn't impact labor in those areas. It absolutely does. And it's one of the things that's probably most difficult in these conversations, that I think people who deploy these systems want to sort of labor wash the issue by saying that they're going to, in fact, have a way to supplant those jobs, but they're pushing forward on technology come hell or high water. And that's the view of most automated vehicle startups, is they really don't have a way to address labor. And I'm not suggesting I have an answer for that, but I am suggesting I think there's a framework within which you need to have that discussion.
Alden, why is there a truck driver shortage? Why?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a range of opinions about that question. As I understand it, there's a perspective that it's primarily driven by the fact that being a truck driver, as I mentioned before, is a really tough job. And in a lot of cases, it doesn't pay very well. It requires people to be away from home for long periods of time, et cetera. So it can be a really tough life and, a tough job. And you see that in the data, not just in shortage, but in things like the aging workforce that I mentioned before. Just to address the question you asked before, though, Alex, I think part of the reason we're wanting to talk more openly about this model that we envision, and it's a relatively intuitive model. I don't think we're the first ones to propose this approach of transfer hubs, et cetera, but it is really the approach we've been working on now for quite some time. And there's more to come about some milestones that we're looking to meet in terms of that model and our product. But part of the reason we're talking about this now is I think any kind of rational analysis of the implications of that model will come to the same conclusions that we've come to in terms of what the economic implications are. So, some of the headlines I showed before, there have been studies done about this question. And from my perspective, I think that the challenge with those analyses is that they start from the assumption that jobs are going to be lost and then attempt to quantify how large that job loss is. And I think if you actually take a step back and think about this different approach that integrates people into the model and thinks more about shifting jobs as opposed to eliminating them, the supply and demand effects, the economics are actually relatively straightforward. And I think there are also a number of historical precedents for the positive economic impacts of these types of, not exactly these types of technologies, but some previous technologies. So yes, we are believers that that this will have positive impacts. We'll have to see how it evolves over time, but it's what we're focused on, and it's part of the reason we're so optimistic about where things are headed.
All right, we're still pretty much on time, so we're cool for questions, about 10 more minutes. And I'd like to see how many hands would like to go up for questions, and if I like those hands, otherwise I'm going to keep going. Who's got questions? No questions? You want me to keep going?
It's amazing you can see better with those blue sunglasses on.
I actually, they're prescription, they're not for show. Senator Brandis, is that your hand going up? Because otherwise I've got one. Who's that? There's a gentleman with a red jacket.
That's me.
Right there. Will you, yeah, will you
That's
hand
me.
that gentleman, that handsome
You want
man?
Ed Regan?
Yeah, hand that handsome man the microphone and see what he has to say.
Two very quick questions. One is, do you think this idea of the local delivery still being handled by humans, that part of the truck movement, will be a long-term permanent thing, or will eventually technology, and I'm not raising that from a standpoint of employment, I'm really just trying to think about future of urban settings. Will that be a long-term where we're still going to have drivers operating pretty much the way they do today in urban areas?
Well, the sort of final mile piece, the driver is doing a lot more than just driving. You know, they're actually taking a package to the point of address, and that actually is not relatively well solved today by an automated vehicle. You saw the Starship robot that came in earlier, and so you could potentially put a couple of these technologies together where a automated last mile vehicle drives into a city center. These small little satellite robots go and do a final delivery, but I think that's kind of putting together 3 or 4 really difficult things. And some of the early things that the post office has looked at, the U.S. Post Office, is kind of like automating the driving part while today's driver is doing a lot more mail sorting and mail delivery. And that's probably a more realistic view of what last mile delivery looks like in a city, where you still have a pretty important human component to deliver at the final point of address.
Yeah, I'll add to that. I think I'm curious again, by a show of hands, how many people in the room have ridden in an over-the-road truck before, like a Class 8 tractor trailer? Okay, nice. So those of you who have, I've spent a fair amount of time in them as well, doing ride-alongs, trying to understand some of these challenges. And it was, when I first started doing this, astounding to me how much manual work and outside of the cab work truck drivers do. It's easy to sort of think about drivers just behind the wheel cruising along on the highway, but there are innumerable things, from inspections to moving tandem axles to connecting and disconnecting trailers, that drivers need to do. In some very distant future, is it possible that new technologies might be able to do some of those things, or all of those things? Perhaps. But in terms of the future that we're thinking about, sort of for our lifetimes, and the sort of medium to long term for the industry, we think that there's a pretty important role for people to play in this, in making sure that trucks can move from origin to destination.
Yeah, the second very short question, propulsion. Will the autonomous trucks wind up moving also toward electric vehicles as opposed to diesel vehicles?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think we're all looking forward to seeing some announcements from other companies this week about some of those things. From my perspective, the model that I described today with transfer hubs and local operation does unlock some new approaches to thinking about different types of trucks and different types of power that would allow for more efficient, cleaner operations. That's also an area that's sort of outside of the boundaries of what we spend our time on today. Yeah, we're super excited about the opportunity to think more creatively about those sorts of things.
Yeah, fueling is one of the biggest costs over the life of within, if you look at a freight carrier, it's labor and fuel that are the two biggest line items. You have to, of course, today think about the cost of refueling, in quotes, an electric truck. So there's some give and take there. But I think probably over the longer term, that's true. The final mile vehicles could probably go electric before the long haul stuff. But I see that definitely in the future.
I've got one more question, then we'll leave it to the audience. I hear a lot of pitches from startups and companies talking about what kind of sensors they use in the vehicles. And some of these pitches presuppose that cities and states will spend billions on infrastructure for V2V and V2X. And then you've got people like Elon Musk saying you don't even need LiDAR. So could you each speak as briefly as possible to what you believe to be the bare minimum amount of hardware and infrastructure required to deploy level 4, and what is the safety standard for a minimum level of hardware deployment?
Go ahead, Alden, take that one.
Yeah, Alden, you've got this.
I'm not sure I'm going to give you a satisfying answer. I think we spend a lot of time thinking about that. We are constantly iterating on the design for our sensors, for our software stack, and looking at new technologies which are emerging every day, from new LiDAR technologies to better cameras, all of those sorts of things. I don't think it's possible to say today what that minimum bar will be. It's part of the reason that we're experimenting. It's part of the reason that we're, in some sense, kind of overbuilding our stack to be able to do as much as we can and ensure safety. I personally am really intrigued by the range of approaches that are being taken. You mentioned...
You know who's not intrigued? The cities and states who have to spend billions.
Well, so I'll get to that. I think there's obviously a range of perspectives, from the very minimal to much more kind of infrastructure focused. Our perspective is that when we talk to state departments of transportation and we're asked, how can we help or what can we do to enable these sorts of things, I think there's a lot of interesting ideas around infrastructure, around creating maps that various companies might use. What we generally say is that we think the most valuable thing that states can do in particular is invest in really solid infrastructure on things like lane markings, on things like just quality of roads and pavement. Those are, in a lot of cases, big challenges already for states, and so investing more resources in that kind of infrastructure will be a good complement to our technology because, at least from our specific perspective, we are not expecting to require any kind of V2I or V2V capability in order to operate an independent self-driving truck. And same goes for cars, by the way. So we see the need to be able to operate in the real world as it currently stands. There are things we could collaborate on around things like transfer hubs. That's sort of a new model that either repurposing rest areas or truck stops in various ways. I think there's a lot of creativity available there about how we might enable the model that I've described. But in terms of V2I infrastructure, again, we don't have a crystal ball in terms of what's going to work. So I don't want to say that kind of stuff is not necessary, but it's not part of what we're planning for our product.
This is one of the reasons why Florida is a fantastic state for early deployments, because the way I think about it is the quality of the environment needs to be supplanted by more and more sensors. And depending on what startup you are, you have a different perspective on how many you need and what type and what they do. I think about it like the quality of the weather and the quality of the roads kind of buy you a sensor or two. They discount the sensor package you need, which is fascinating. So if you take all the states that I mentioned that have sort of aggressive AV policy, Florida's probably the best state. It's got great weather, it's got really good roads, and we've got a lot of great straight roads, and it's got a pretty interesting amount of cellular coverage. In my mind, that means I'm putting actually fewer sensors early on in the car, whereas if I'm deploying in Alpena, Michigan, then I'm really festooning the thing with as many LiDAR and radar as I can. That's the way I think about it.
My next startup for self-driving truck will be called Festoon. We have time for one more question. Actually, we don't, but the audience looks cranky. So we'll take it, and then I'm going to cut them off. Who's that person?
I got the mic. So
Okay.
All right. So we got politicians in the room. We got policymakers in the room. I want to challenge the labor model that I've heard from you guys. It seems very static. And so when I think of the labor model, I think there's already drastic changes happening that aren't being properly addressed by freight. So you look at e-commerce and how many deliveries do we see being run in routes today in our local neighborhoods. And so with the proliferation of e-commerce, with the changing of the corner store, all of a sudden it's a grocery store, and there's things like eggs and ice cream in the corner store. And then you think about the fact that trucks are currently optimized based off labor and load, and that may change with the introduction of autonomous technologies. Is there a more efficient route using your transfer hub model? And I think from a Uber standpoint, that would be something that's important to address, and maybe we got a preview today. Maybe next year we get a preview of what is the labor model, because I don't think it's zero sum. I think it actually grows the amount of things that want to move. The cheaper and the easier it gets that things can move, they want to move more. And that will probably open up more local jobs. But that's just an idea. I don't have data to back that up.
Each of you have exactly 2 minutes, because everyone here's got to go to the bathroom.
Yeah, I'll take less than that. I think that's a great comment. You know, when we think about this vision for the future, it's really important to us that we try to have some humility about what that holds. So we're not going to today or in the future spell out exactly what the world is going to look like in 2018, 2019. We want to talk about the sorts of things that we're trying to build, and we welcome analysis and opinions and thoughts about what the implications of the model might be. That's part of the reason we wanted to share this today, was just to open up the conversation and allow well-intentioned analysis to understand some of these challenges, to think about what this transfer hub and complementary truck drivers and self-driving trucks might actually do compared to some of the analysis that's been done already. I think that assumes a much more static model where trucks are just driving themselves everywhere, and we just don't think that that's going to be the case. So I appreciate the comment, and would welcome thoughts about how to think about that future.
Riley?
Yeah, I would say it's a really interesting point, because once you become an Amazon Prime member, for example, you don't go back, and you have this tendency towards ease and convenience. And you see a future where if last mile gets cheaper and cheaper, the prices of those things get cheaper, you're more likely to move some of your grocery store trips to be delivery. And I think the really interesting thing is you want that stuff to become unified, or at least managed. Right now, you might get 2 or 3 different Amazon deliveries within the same day, which doesn't make sense for you or Amazon. And so I think one of the things that this points to is the easier and cheaper some of these services become, they actually tend toward one unified service. So whether that means Amazon handling a lot of that last mile logistics for you and giving it to you at 7:05 p.m. after you come home from work, or Uber, on the other hand, offering more commerce within their platform, those are likely. That's the band playing me off stage. That's likely the future of one of those two scenarios.
Thank you very much, Riley, and thank you very much, Alden. We've got a 20-minute break, maybe 19 minutes, and then we're going to come back for even more excitement and secrets may be revealed with our next round of guests. Please enjoy your break.